An increasing proportion of Britons regret Brexit. The gap has surged to the highest level since 2016, and it is set to grow over time as pro-European younger voters replace older Brexit supporters leaving the electorate. The current deal is contributing to the UK's dire economic performance. The IMF predict in 2023 the UK will have lower economic growth than even Russia. And this is on top of very poor real wage growth since 2016. But what does the UK do next? We will look at different options, from rejoining the single market and customs union to incremental changes such as dynamic alignment. In the short term, rejoining the EU is really off the table. No political party wants it, the EU doesn't really want it, and as mentioned in this video, it would be less attractive than the pre-2016 deal because the UK wouldn't have the same opt-outs on the Euro and Schengen. Anyway, any plan to rejoin would require steady integration over many years, rebuilding trust, and quite possibly a new generation of politicians. This is a matrix of different options for the UK from the current deal. At the moment, we have mostly free trade in goods, but significant custom barriers and tariffs on some services. We are not obliged to follow EU rules, and we do not have free movement of labour. Any shift to greater integration would gain better trade terms, but have some trade-off, like following EU rules or accepting free movement. It is a matrix that has tortured the British political class for the past 6 years. But a general election next year may enable a fresh start. Firstly, a less confrontational attitude might improve relations. It could also involve finding areas of agreement, such as European research programmes, linking emission trading schemes, new visa arrangements. Goodwill and a new start would ease tensions. But, as trade experts say, it is merely tinkering at the edges.
We're really looking at things very small and around the margins. So the big, if there was an obvious way to make things better, I think many of these steps would already have been taken. If you wanted to be really dramatic, you could try to align more British regulation with EU regulation and make some formal commitments that potentially could persuade the EU to let British merchandise in without additional checks.
A key feature is a level playing field. The EU don't want to be undercut by a Singapore-style UK economy, offering low tax and low regulations to undercut firms in the single market. This is why regulatory alignment is so important. The Labour Party is quietly inching towards dynamic alignment. This means the UK and EU would maintain equivalent regulatory standards to each other. In essence, the UK would become a rule taker from the Europe on standards. This is a red line for Brexiteers and has been rejected by the current government. But Labour, who are generally keener on labour and environmental standards, may feel it is worth improved trade. If accepted, it could enable the removal of many checks between Great Britain and the EU and lead to freer trade. Regulatory alignment may seem a betrayal to hardline Brexiteers, but it is not the kind of issue that is going to swing too many voters. It's not very exciting, but an industry by industry regulatory alignment would reduce some of the frictions to trade. Now, some Brexiteers would argue the whole point of Brexit is to go the other way and diverge as much as possible from European regulation. Brexiteers argue that full deregulation would give the UK a competitive advantage in sectors such as AI and financial services. However, it is not clear that business value deregulation. The British Chambers of Commerce report that for most business it is a very low priority. Also, deregulation risks environmental costs, and the financial deregulation could lead to turmoil we saw in the financial crisis when we deregulated the mortgage industry and banks. A customs union involves a common external tariff. It does not require free movement of labour, so it's politically more feasible. A customs union very nearly passed Parliament under Theresa May back in 2018. There would be quite a few advantages. there will be less custom checks. For example, Eurostar are running trains at 30% empty because they cannot process extra post-Brexit checks. It would also make it easier for small business to export to Europe, because currently custom forms and checks can be very expensive, becoming a drag on export business.
Trying to sell into Europe, it's been much more complex than it was pre-Brexit. We just know at the moment it's just it's a hassle really to sort of try and organise getting in there.
Something that often comes up is a Swiss-style trade deal. But this is very unlikely to occur because the EU don't actually like the Swiss-style bilateral deal. What is often not talked about is that the EU actually quite like the current UK-EU trade cooperation because it provides tariff-free trade in goods where the EU has a trade surplus, but is more restrictive in services where the EU has a deficit. The EU are only going to bargain in their own self-interest. The hope to have our cake and eat it is not going to happen. One option worth considering in the long term is the European Economic Area. It includes 3 EFTA countries, Norway, Iceland and Liechtenstein, 1 small country and 2 minnows. You could argue it is like a purely economic version of the European Union. Many years ago, Brexiteers used to talk fondly of Norway having the benefits of a single market, but without being sucked into European superstate. It involves the single market, 4 freedoms, being essentially a rule taker, and essentially being subject to the decisions of the European Court of Justice. It is quite popular in Norway, and the country is quite settled on its European compromise. For UK citizens, fed up with never-ending Brexit debates and uncertainties, it seems Norwegians are no longer banging on about Europe, to quote David Cameron. Ironically, it's something the UK seems unable to stop. The idea of getting Brexit done seems far from reality. Of course, admitting the UK into the EEA would raise different issues because of the size of the UK economy, and it is not clear Norway and the EEA will be so keen to rock the boat with the UK potentially a troublesome partner. However, it could be the kind of long-term solution to aim at. One thing to point out, the current Brexit deal has definitely undermined the UK economy to some extent, but it is far from the only cause. It is more like an extra weight on a sinking ship. The UK economy was struggling before 2016, and even if we did rejoin the single market, it will be no panacea. In a future video, I'll try to examine the extent of Brexit and the UK's economic decline. So where do we go from here? In the short term, it's likely the Conservatives and Brexiteers will lose the next election, and this would enable a Labour government to work towards greater cooperation and quite possibly dynamic alignment. If this goes well, it may encourage them to consider rejoining the customs union as a step to rejoining the single market. So nothing's going to happen very quickly, but in the long term, there will be this demographic pressure from younger people to go towards closer reintegration to Europe. The UK may never rejoin the European Union, but I think the current state is unlikely to last, just given the demographics and how badly Brexit has gone so far. If you haven't seen already, do check out this video on why the UK is unlikely to join the European Union because of the euro.